All right, welcome to I guess this is just Racket Live, Racket live stream. I'm Matt Taibbi. Thanks everybody for turning out. Can everybody hear me loud and clear? Uh, just want to make sure. Um, so, subject for today, uh, we've been working on a story for a little while now with Public, with Michael Schellenberger, Alexander Gutentag, myself. Uh, Public was the recipient first of a cache of documents by a whistleblower who has had kind of a tough time. Has been trying to get somebody to pay attention to these documents, and finally, somebody did. The subject of the document cache is a thing called the CTI League, which, if you blinked, you probably didn't notice it because it was only in the news very briefly in early 2020. And in fact, when I first heard about this story and first got the sort of 30,000-foot version of what this was supposed to be, um, I kind of instinctively thought there's probably not going to be a whole lot there because the players involved didn't seem to be particularly significant, and there weren't any overt ties that you would see online uh, suggesting that this group CTI League developed into anything meaningful. However, once we got a look at these documents and once we found out the full context of what's in there, it turned out to be very, very significant. Now, this is a very complicated story. The backstory of this is very complicated. It's going to take some time to flush all that out and explain it. I should probably recommend from the start that people go and visit uh, this article that's on Public right now. Um, and this is by Michael, Alex, and myself. I worked on it a little bit. They were very generous to let me participate in working on the story. They did the hard work of kind of going through the chronology, dating everything in this piece. Um, and look, again, this is going to be very difficult to explain. Just very, very briefly, the CTI League, I believe it's the uh, Cyber Threat Intelligence League, or CTIL, was essentially formally founded in March of 2020. This is it was supposed to be narrowly construed as an organization that only combated COVID misinformation. The group was pitched as an all-volunteer effort. Um, the most important members, the people whose names you might have recognized if you came from this community, included a British woman named Sarah Jane Terp, or S.J. Terp. And then there was an American defense official named Pablo Brewer. He's sometimes described in the news as a technologist, or who with experience working for the Navy and for SOCOM, the Special Operations Command. But theoretically, this was just a volunteer organization with a bunch of people in tech and who had some experience with this kind of work, who got together to kind of help hospitals avoid the onslaught of cyber threats. Once you get in the middle of the documents, though, you find out that it's not at all narrowly construed to be about cyber mis and disinformation. That they have many interests. There's some funny documents where they say, like, we're not interested in aliens, but we're interested in anything, current events. They were intensely interested in elections. They were cataloging all kinds of political activity, from anti-lockdown movements to pro-Palestinian movements to hashtag healthcare for all. So there was stuff on the left, but especially on the right. Um, but the most important thing, well, there's two really key things about these documents, um, and without delving too much into the specifics, because that's going to take quite a long time um, to make all of that clear. This group ended up having an influence. We're not exactly sure how, but clearly elements of CTI League ended up appearing in um, operations like the Election Integrity Partnership, which was run through Stanford and some other private partners later in the year. Then the Virality Project, which is about the same topic. But more importantly, DHS, the Department of Homeland Security, and its sub-agency, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, its chief, Chris Krebs, announced that it was formally partnering with CTI League that April. And then later on, DHS formally adopted basically a sort of all-encompassing program for countering disinformation that had been developed in part by the CTI League people. The initial name for this thing was Amit, AMITT. Eventually, it was renamed Disarm. Another name for it was Attack, but instead of the A in Attack, there's a $sign for some reason. That framework ended up being sort of formally adopted by DHS. So there were a lot of people, I think, who were recruited into CTI League who thought they were getting into something relatively innocent. But if you look at the documents, they're really significant for one big reason, and this has to do with things that we never learned in the Twitter files. The Twitter files told us an awful lot about what was going on with digital censorship, the involvement of the federal government, of agencies like the FBI, DHS, Department of Defense. But what they didn't teach us, what they didn't tell us anything about, was the extent to which sort of what they call offensive information operations were being used in the United States. We saw a lot of the defensive. So if you think of content moderation, censorship, de-amplification, all that stuff comes out in Twitter files. And the importance of the Twitter files is that it's sort of proved irrefutably that these things existed. Well, in the CTI files, they're kind of amazing because these documents show, incontrovertibly, they instruct the people who are in the CTI League in techniques of what you might call offensive information operations. And just to go straight to some of this material, rather than go to the first thread that I did, which is really introductory about CTI League, I decided to just focus on the second thread, which is what I call sock puppets and spies. And here you can see in the CTI files written about today by Schellenberger and Alex Gutentag, anti-disinformation warriors and officials offer instruction on COINTELPRO-style spy tactics against a target they knew was forbidden the American public. And we'll get into all of this, but it's all there in black and white with these documents. So the documents are broken down into different categories. There are video trainings. There are incident reports about things that are happening that they consider disinformation. Then there's a big thing they called the Big Book of Disinformation Response that was handled out and to everybody who was involved in this program. And they held trainings on how to conduct yourself and how to do certain things. And one of the things they trained the CTI League members in was, how to do stuff like infiltrate groups using sock puppet accounts. And this is the kind of thing that we just never saw like written down in the Twitter files. So here's a panel from, a slide from one of the presentations we saw. What recipes do we need? I think this was in the OPSEC training. What recipes do we need? Well, we need sock puppets on Twitter and Facebook. So you can get into invite-only groups for things like Boogaloo, the Boogaloo Boys. And again, you don't often see someone just write outright, yeah, we want to do sock puppet accounts, and we want to do that so that we can infiltrate groups like the Boogaloo Boys. And remember, this is happening. This is a document that was coming out basically contemporaneously with the DHS. I'm sorry, with the CISA chief, Chris Krebs. Talking about how proud he is to be working with CTI League. So this group was doing that. They used some more colorful language later, talking about how they had some fun with telling people how to get involved with creating their personas. Key concepts: security, it's a process. Tools help you execute the process. Compartmentation, separate your personal life from your work life. They have a whole thing about that, like use a separate computer, make sure, it's like sort of Junior League spy stuff. Like if you get captured, make sure that the interrogations don't go farther than you, make sure that there aren't leads to the next step in the chain. Persona, your spy disguise. For research, a fleshed out human being that has details. And then the further step, lock your shit down. Now, the funny thing about lock your shit down is that these people who are, I'm sorry to say, one of the humorous aspects of the story, it's not really humorous, it's kind of sad, but the people who are involved in running this show were overwhelmingly not terribly bright. And while they were giving detailed instructions on OPSEC and locking your shit down, they ended up leaving huge amounts of stuff in the public domain, including these trainings, which they're not advertised anywhere, but they were there. They were findable. We got them through other means, but we discovered they were already up there. If you look for them, there's a lot of other stuff that's still up there. That's kind of shocking that they haven't taken down too. And so it's funny that here they are telling their people to lock your shit down when they themselves didn't lock anything down, or didn't lock much. Okay, again, use burner phones, right? Come on, how high tech do you really need to be warning hospitals about medical misinformation? Why do you need burner phones? Something a little bit off about that, do you think? You definitely see this phenomenon. We saw a little bit of it in the Twitter files, where people who were just sort of boring tech executives, once they started to become be contacted by people in the intelligence community, they suddenly started using all kinds of acronyms: OPSEC, OSINT, human, et cetera, like they were characters in a John le Carré novel. And that's definitely going on here. But really, in this big book of disinformation response, which is sort of like your handbook for how to do this work, there are just multiple instructions about using burner phones, burner accounts, fake identities, and so on and so forth. So again, leaving little doubt about what they're up to. Now, again, the difference between CTI League and everything else is there are constant references to going on offense, not just defensively taking things down or recommending taking things down, but going beyond that. And we'll get into what some of those things are, but this is one of the examples that jumped out at me. There's an incident report where they see a meme about where, I guess, people who are anti-lockdown were inviting the Gilets Jaunes, the Yellow Vest movement, to sort of join forces. So this is the dreaded horseshoe theory phenomenon. And you can see the response by CTI League, and they're saying, do we have enough to ask for the groups and or accounts to be taken down or at minimum reported and checked? And can we get all troll on their bums if not? What the fuck is that? Like, first of all, how is this disinformation? How is this at all a problem for people to legitimately reach out to other political groups like the Gilets Jaunes and say, hey, would you like to get involved in protesting the lockdowns? And remember, this wasn't like absolute medical consensus about this. And as it turned out, there were a lot of people who were wrong about this stuff. And yet they just openly, immediately define it as a threat. They're already talking about taking speech like this down. There's nothing in there that's even close, remotely like disinformation. But if they can't take it down, if they can't manage to get that done, can we get all troll in their bums? Not exactly sure what that means yet. Unfortunately, that's one of the things that happens early in sort of document review stories. You end up looking at a lot of stuff, you don't know exactly what it means, but you can be your own judge at this point. So there was that. Then we can also take actions like takedowns. You see that's written here. Now, the whistleblower in the story talked about being told by S.J. Terp that she claimed to have had the capability to, through the FBI, to get some content removed via basically a DNS takedown. So that's something that we hadn't even considered in the Twitter files. Is, you know, in the Twitter files we were looking at government agencies that were asking platforms like Facebook, Twitter, Google to remove content. But what if you can do it at the source? What if you can just say that, you know, X material is so dangerous that it needs to be just removed from the internet? And there is a methodology for doing that, and that is referenced a few times. There are a couple of people I talked to who suggested that this was feasible. A few others were skeptical that that's what that actually meant, but I thought it was worth passing on. The source did say that that this is what that person was told, and moreover, there are multiple references to takedowns. We've also seen takedowns, that word takedown, used in that context to refer to a DNS takedown. So I think it's not impossible that that's what they mean. All right, now I'm going to play a couple of videos. Let's see how this works in this format. But this is a woman named Deb Lavoie who's in this group. She's part of something called the Reality Team. She's a former marketing executive. And this is a theme we heard over and over and over again in the trainings and in the documents. And let's just take a listen.
Basically, we're using many of the same techniques as the bad guys, but we're doing it in a good way. We are helping people to understand the reality of complex situations. We are helping them to avoid confusion, and we are helping to make simple, repeatable hopefully viral concepts that can saturate the information space in the same way bad guys do.
We want to do the same stuff the bad guys are doing. Doesn't get any more ridiculous than that. And when you really dig into what they mean by that, and you start to get some hints through some of these documents, it's pretty messed up. And they have absolutely no compunction about doing it, because these people have no ability to no self-awareness. They're unable to look at themselves and say, gee, do we really have the legal, moral, ethical right to go in and use disruptive techniques to alter reality, to suppress speech, to disrupt people, to use to infiltrate groups, to use fake identities domestically. There's just none of that reflection. They do talk about that as a logistical problem, but they never talk about whether or not that this is indicated or appropriate. They just assume it is. And this tells you a lot about the mindset of these folks. And what's interesting about this is that I had seen this, and the Twitter files gave us some insight into this, because there were a number of people who came from the counterterrorism world who thought this way because they were accustomed to thinking this way, right? Like when you're fighting against ISIS or Al Qaeda, you're not going to sweat rules too much, and you've probably been told that it's okay to take the gloves off. But that transition, what one person called, CT to CP, counterterrorism to counterpopulism, that's more understandable in my mind than what we're dealing with a lot of the people in the CTI League, who are corporate marketing executives, who are taking their experience basically doing brand management, sort of figuring out what on social media might result in a more positive image of their company and what might result in a negative image, and manipulating that as best they can, but shifting that knowledge over to and that expertise to selling things like government policies, lockdowns, one political party over another. There is another video that I'll probably get into at a different time, involving a different executive talking about using these techniques to sell the war in Afghanistan. But these people are believers, right? Like that's a key to understanding why this thing works, or why it went so far, because there's just no self-doubt, and they didn't even feel like they needed to hide it in any of these communications. That they claim to have as many as 500 people involved in CTI League, and they didn't feel a need to soft pedal any of this stuff. With a lot of these folks were civilians. They just assumed, as the source told me, they assumed that anyone who was smart thought like they did. So that one's amazing. Now here we come to a key sort of passage in one of the training videos, and it's basically one of the co-founders of CTI League. It's a person who was listed as being in the Navy still at the time that CTI League was founded. He's also, again, listed as a Special Operations Command technologist in some news stories, including news stories where he was quoted. So I think it's appropriate to talk about Pablo Brewer as being affiliated with what you might call SOCOM, right? The Special Operations Command. And there is a fascinating moment in these trainings where Brewer lays out basically the problem of countering misinformation for governments with regard to the United States. It's a legal problem, and then it's also an expertise problem. But you'll see why it's so significant in a moment. There are 3 different videos, and I'll play them in a row pretty quickly.
The people that have the capability don't have the legal authority, right? And so the people that have the capability and expertise to do this is the U.S. Department of Defense. But the U.S. Department of Defense is expressly forbidden by presidential directive and by law from operating against U.S. citizens, right? And so it's kind of a third rail.
So, first of all, significant that he uses the term against U.S. citizens, but this is a sort of remarkably candid description of what's going on. Anti-disinformation is something, who has the capability? Well, Brewer is from the DoD, he's from SOCOM, and he claims that that capability rests solely with the Department of Defense. But the DoD can't do it because of presidential directive. They're expressly forbidden by law from operating against U.S. citizens, which appears to be what they want to do. So what do you do about that? Well, he goes on.
The people that do it overseas are typically the CIA and the NSA and the Department of Defense. But again, I've already talked about that. Intel collection agencies are not legally allowed to do those things inside the United States.
The people who do it overseas are the CIA, the NSA, and the Department of Defense. First of all, again, lock your shit down. Like, the OPSEC on this is not awesome. Not that everyone doesn't know that they do this, but it's hard to imagine a real CIA person or NSA person or, even a DoD person like himself actually admitting that we do this kind of thing abroad. Everybody knows we do it, but what does it mean? What do they mean by it? Well, that's kind of the question, right? That's where the rubber meets the road. I reached out to Brewer. He did respond, but only to try to verify my identity. He has not answered any questions. I'd be very anxious to hear what he has to say. But again, they're talking about DoD has the capability. They can't do it. Typically, it is done overseas by the CIA, NSA, and DoD, but they don't have the legal authority to do it at home. So what are we left with? And this brings us to the last video.
Americans have a healthy distrust of their government, and it just wouldn't look good. So the people it's actually sitting with right now is the Department of State. And the Department of State now has a new cell called the GEC, the Global Engagement Center. And they're supposed to be doing it. Now, they're essentially brand new. They're just getting something like $250 million next fiscal year. They're just ramping up. Frankly, they're not very capable right now. But we need to help them out by deciding, what kind of things can we do proactively? Yes, education's great for the kids that are in school now, but what do we do with John and Jane Q. Citizen that actually, watch Fox News and believe pandemic? What do we do with those guys? Americans have a health.
What do we do with people who actually watch Fox News? I mean, it's just unbelievable that a person would say this kind of thing out loud. And then there's so many things that are striking about this. Well, the Global Engagement Center, they got $250 million, but they're not very capable. Are you kidding me? You got $250 million and what? That's not enough? Like, that's like the budget for the entire American alternative media. But for them, it's apparently, insignificant. I think, by the way, the State Department is actually affirmatively proscribed from doing this in ways that are even more strongly put than than the Smith-Mundt Act and the directives against the foreign intelligence services getting involved with that kind of activity. But that doesn't come up here. But this is very similar to what we heard from Alex Stamos of the Election Integrity Partnership, who said basically, there's this video where he very candidly says, yeah, EIP is doing this because CISA and the Department of Homeland Security, they lack kind of the funding and the legal authorization to do this. So basically, like, we're going to step in. And this is very similar. It's like DoD can't, people who do it overseas can't. And that leaves us with DHS, which is incapable, DHS and GEC, who aren't capable, so they kind of need us to help. And it's just laid right out. I mean, and this is very similar to what we saw with the Election Integrity Partnership, the same kinds of explanations. Why do we need these quasi-private organizations? Because it would be illegal if a federal enforcement agency or an intelligence service or the Department of Defense got involved with any kind of information suppression, let alone some of the stuff that they talk about doing later on, and we're going to get into that in a second. But that little exposition by Brewer is important because it lays out the justification for why do we need these organizations like EIP, VP, CTI League. What's the significance of that? Why can't we just have somebody at the DHS doing it? And they have tried to do that, but there would be legal issues. There would be First Amendment challenges. In other places, other people at CTIL talk about how, hey, if we did the same stuff that they do so well in China, people in America would be wailing about the First Amendment. So like that's not available to us. So we have to think of other ways. And look, this is what they came up with. So that was significant. I just had to put this in there because this is just a really interesting thing. I reached out to this person, analyst named Roy Zinman. I'm just going to play this video. You tell me what you think of it, but here's what it says.
And another big actor in the last few years is Turkey, which no one speaks about a lot, but Turkey is has a very strong tradition of information operations, intelligence information operations. So Turkey directed most of its efforts in the last years, of course, against the Kurdish minority. And they did some really interesting false flag campaigns to pin ISIS bombings on the Kurds, or to pin bombings made by the Turkish intelligence in Kurdish demonstrations on ISIS, vice versa.
Some really interesting false flag operations to pin ISIS bombings on the Kurds. This is in the context of kind of speaking admiringly of the capability of Turkey, which, by the way, is a NATO country. They're, an ally of ours. I guess we're cool with one of our allies cooking up fake stories to blame ISIS bombings on their Kurdish minority. But, whatever. Again, I'd like to know more about that story, but I haven't heard from Mr. Zinman. Just quickly, I see Simon from Florida asking, saying Virality Project was not at all the same subject as the Elections Integrity Project. Yeah, I know that what I was referring to is that the Virality Project was the same subject as the CTI League. Both were ostensibly about the pandemic. So that's what I was saying. But that seemed like a pretty startling admission to me. And we're going to start hearing it, and this is something that I heard from people in the counterterrorism world during the Twitter Files period. Where they would talk sort of admiringly about some of the work that they did, and in some cases, you can kind of understand it. They did things that were extraordinarily clever. We did have a problem, you could say, with a national security issue with people in the young Americans in the suburbs, of Southern California or outside London responding positively to the propaganda from ISIS or Islamic State or Al Qaeda, and they did do some very interesting things. They did some really dumb things, but they did some really interesting things too. Like they put out counter messaging talking about how the promises of land that you're hearing about on the internet. Well, our military just seized all that land, so you're not going to get that. You have a very high likelihood of dying. Blah blah blah. That was like an example of the kind of thing they did over there. They also used information operations for operational purposes. They would put out fake stories, for instance, that this or that terrorist suspect contracted a venereal disease. The person would get mad, would break protocol, would get on a cell phone, dial a friend, and scream and yell, "That's not true, that's a lie." And then the instant they dial that phone, the drone would blow up. And that's the kind of thing that these people did. And so there was some admiration for within that community for the cleverness of these sorts of operations in a more military situation, right? Like you can understand it a little bit more. But now the idea of taking this stuff home and overlaying the same thinking that you brought to ISIS or a foreign terrorist group or a group that's like openly taking up arms against the United States, and applying that to domestic organizations like the Boogaloo Boys is incredible. And in this, just as a quick diversion, here's a place where I think it's important to look at this panel from another one of their presentations. One of their teachings sort of started off by quoting a 2007 Pentagon manual on information warfare, and it talks about mitigations and counters. Countermeasures are that form of military science that by the employment of devices and/or techniques is designed to impair the operational effectiveness of enemy activity. So these people, their mindset is we're going up against an enemy. Well, theoretically, that makes a little sense if you're talking about maybe Russian disinformation or Chinese or Iranian disinformation. But these people were looking primarily at domestic groups, and whether it's what they called the Fox News snorters or the Boogaloo Boys or whoever. They're taking this military mindset and bringing it home, and see zero problem with it whatsoever. The only problem they see is the logistical, legal one, and that's terrifying. So here's another video. This is from SJ Terp. This is SJ Terp talking. You will hear her voice, which rings out in a lot of these videos, and she's talking about Chat GPT.
And then there's creation. So you've probably seen some of the new stuff about GPT-2, GPT-3 being used on text. And one of the cool things it can do is you feed it stuff and it starts generating out credible text, credible sentences. And that for us is interesting because the bad guys can use that. Actually, the good guys can use it too as part of the response, but that's another topic for another day.
Again, awesome OPSEC there. Like, yeah, actually, we can do it too, but you know, we'll talk about that some other time. What is that about? We're gonna have AI generated bots flooding the information landscape, and you can see how and where and why they might end up using that capability. Maybe not CTI League exactly, but there are descriptions in some of these documents of where that might come up. But again, there's this dichotomy of good guys and bad guys, the assumption that we're the good guys, the assumption that we're the good guys domestically, and the assumption that it's okay for us to do the stuff that the bad guys do because we're the good guys. Yeah, I mean, this is like third grade level thinking. I mean, I think that's actually insulting to third graders. Frankly, it's astonishing to me that these people think like this. They must have grown up in some like a hermetically sealed universe full of people who only think like each other. That's the only conclusion I can come to. All right, so the Amit which is the program that was developed in part by some of the founders. Like SJ Terp was involved in the development of this thing called Amit, and Amit stands for let's see, I forget what it is. Adversarial misinformation and influence tactics and techniques. It was eventually renamed Disarm. You can see in Schellenberger's piece, there's sort of a, this is the Amit Countermeasures framework, and it talks about all the different wonderful things you can do in anti-disinformation work. You can do things like cut off banking access, pre-bunking, rate limit engagement, et cetera, et cetera. There was one really interesting one that I think is in a previous version that talked about cowing social media influencers, honeypot social community, FBI information voids, reduced political targeting, content moderation, prohibit images and political channels. So that's another way of making sure that people can communicate with each other without being monitored, right? Because images are much harder to monitor. So Amit is a framework that they were adopting, they were espousing, and Amit was ultimately, by that time it was renamed Disarm, but it was ultimately adopted by DHS. So Amit matters. Amit is not just some fanciful thing. It's important because it offers a little bit of a roadmap into the thinking of what these people imagine are appropriate tactics for counter disinformation work. And one of the things they did, and this goes back to that lock your shit up panel, is they left a list of 233 counter procedures up for the public to see. And these include things like infiltrating groups to discredit their leaders, name and shame influencers, let's see, block access to disinformation resources, honeypot social community, establish a truth teller reputation score for influencers. This is sort of like your NewsGuard situation. Like if you have a score, you can alter the visibility or up and down of certain voices. Downgrade, de-amplify, so message is seen by fewer people, so here they're openly talking about de-amplification, which again, people not that long ago denied existed at all. Content moderation, use banking to cut off access, deplatform account, deplatform message groups, bomb link shorteners with lots of calls. Let's see, buy out troll former employees to offer them jobs. Oh, this is a different issue, but I thought it was important to talk about. Now, the counter that they're talking about here is improving coordination among stakeholders, public and private. And there's a long sort of exposition here. Coordinated disinformation challenges are increasingly multidisciplinary. There are a few organizations within the national security structures that are equipped with the broad spectrum capability to effectively counter large-scale conflict short of war tactics in real time. Institutional hurdles currently impede diverse subject matter experts hailing from outside of the traditional national security and foreign policy disciplines. For example, physical science, engineering, media, legal, and economic fields. So they seem to be concerned about institutional experts who come from outside the traditional national security and foreign policy realms. That's like a problem for them. So this is listed, and there's a lot more of those. This sort of aim at counters stuff. There are so many crazy things in this list that it's going to require a whole feature to itself to get into, and there's going to be research that probably Schellenberger, myself, and maybe some other folks are going to get into, but you can find that link on your own. Just look it up until they shut it down, and you'll see all the 233 different tactics that they might be using online. And they talk about flooding the zone with information to try to distract you from what they consider disinformation. And this I think is what they mean when they talk about the people who do it overseas. What's it? Well, this is it, right? Like, I think it includes all of these offensive tactics, and that's why we have to start thinking differently about terms like anti-disinformation. One industry person I talked to compared that term anti-disinformation to like the renaming of the Department of Defense, when it really should be the Department of bombing the shit out of other places, or the Department of War. Anti-disinformation, counter messaging, yeah, it sounds defensive. It's not. This is offensive political operations, and the crux of this whole story is bringing this home. When we first saw this in the Twitter files, we saw half of it. We saw the defensive half, but we were told, by a number of people that your story is about offensive. It's about information operations. It's about offensive information operations, and it's about bringing those home. We've always done it overseas. My own magazine, Rolling Stone, back in 2005, they did a tremendous story. A guy named James Bamford did a story about how a Pentagon contracted agency arranged for a source that had been developed by the CIA, but who had already flunked a lie detector test. Supposedly was a scientist for Saddam Hussein who knew all about weapons of mass destruction. The government isn't allowed to just sort of hand stories like that to the New York Times, but they could do it overseas. They could do it through an intermediary private company. And that's how it was done back then. You leaked the stories overseas and then they trickled back home or whatever it was. Well, now they're skipping the middleman. They're going straight to the source. And we're in this world where these kinds of operations are happening domestically, and sometimes they're going to be through middlemen, but sometimes not. Anyway, moving on. This I just thought was, and it's just a window into the kind of thinking of these people. They listed this meme, which came out during the lockdowns. Here's your signed permission slip to leave your house. Har har. It's a joke. It's like the Declaration of Independence is my permission slip to leave my house. Like, fuck you, right? That's speech. That's a thing that people say, right? And they look at this and it's a problem. Oh my gosh, we should have seen this one coming. Seeing a lot of these, and why do they think that way? Because they do not have a very positive view of satire. In fact, they oops, sorry, am I in the right place? I just showed you the wrong thing. I'm sorry. Let me go back here. Here's the meme. Here's the signed permission slip to leave your house. Declaration of Independence. We should have seen this one coming. Oh my God, how horrifying, right? And then there's this, which is in one of the notes. Satire is sometimes a gateway drug into more worrying groups. This is the way these people think. Like, I mean, I'm literally speechless at the mindset of somebody who could write something like that. This is the United States of America. You're allowed to say the craziest shit you can possibly think of in this country. That's the whole point of the United States. Is we are legally permitted to say almost anything. Our opinions are our own, and we have the right to complain in any way we want to the government. This whole idea of we should have seen this coming, like the Declaration of Independence, holding up the Declaration of Independence as my permission slip. Well, it's not the Declaration, but the Bill of Rights specifically says we have the right to petition for redress of grievances. That's true. What are they trying to tell us? That's disinformation? Why are they tracking this? Because it's people who are against lockdowns? That's not disinformation. That's belief. That's political opinion. And they can't distinguish it. Not only that, but jokes to them there's no such thing as humor in this world. Like humor is like a bad thing because, we're missing that part of our brain that would be able to understand it. And they even go on to admit this in kind of a funny way. Here's Terp again talking about this.
Things like satire are really hard. We actually had satire detectors at one thing I worked on because it just shows up as positive, even though it's completely negative. Like /s just doesn't show. It's like nice work, bro, or the usual satirical irony just doesn't work on machines.
So yeah, obviously, right? Like irony doesn't work on machines because that's why human beings are different from machines. We are able to appreciate unquantifiable things that makes us unique and different from machines, which is a good thing. Um, they can't see it that way. What they see is that satire and humor screws up their ability to measure things like sentiment or affinity. Um, and this whole thing about talking about how it shows up as a positive when it's actually a negative, like oh my god, this statement about how this person feels about their Ford Taurus, it was actually a put down when it was phrased as praise, and that's going to screw up our whole analysis of how people feel about Fords. And you know so we can't have humor. I mean, like this is like the level at which these people are operating. It's absolutely maddening. um, but at least they're conceding something that people who've been following this stuff have been saying for years, which is that the kind of algorithmic analysis that they think is going to work, is going to save the world from hate speech and disinformation, is totally unable to recognize two very important things. One is humor and satire, and the other is reporting. The difference between showing, for instance, somebody like, a Richard Spencer, and reporting on what that person is saying versus endorsing what that person is saying. They don't have a machine that's been able to figure out the difference between that. So their solution is just to ban everything, or to ban it for certain kinds of people. And and when you really drill down into that, and when you start talking about who's allowed to publish that kind of material and who isn't, you see what they're really doing here, which is they're allowing, they're relying entirely on authority and who has the right credentials, whereas somebody else is questionable, right? And that's what they're doing, as opposed to judging, weighing truth and untruth and fact and fiction, which is incredibly difficult. And journalists have recognized for ages is basically an impossibility. Like there is no such thing as objective truth; it's an aspiration only. Um, you can't do it definitively. Even people who write in that style know that, but they pretend that they're doing that when they're actually doing something that you can do definitively, which is, this is politically appropriate, this is in line with current narrative, this is not. Those distinctions can be made by machine, and that's what they're up to. Moving on, this I just thought was interesting. Not sure exactly what it means, but it's in the big book of disinformation response. We are already building and using bots. And then here's something that I wanted to put in just because, there's going to be the inevitable criticism that, oh, you're only talking about the political right. There's an article, by the way, coming out on Racket either tonight or early tomorrow morning about the partisan nature of all this stuff. Even if you're no fan of the Republican Party, even if you, you you would move out of the country if Donald Trump were to win the election, it's impossible to miss the partisan nature of what they're up to. The people, the way they talk about politics, they just assume that everybody votes for Democrats, and that there's no other way to think about that. However, they're not entirely obsessed with sort of rightist movements. You can see on some of their, and I'm sorry, this is very hard to read, but this comes from a screenshot from a video, so that's the best we could do. But you can see my DSA anti-war there. Then there's at USC PR, which is the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights. We found another one for hashtag healthcare for all, a whole bunch of sort of lefty movements kind of in that Corbynite, Bernie Sanders range, which they just instinctively assume is also a threat or worth following. So, this is, in case anybody wants to say that this is right-wing disinformation, this whole thing, well, this is actually, the CTI League also shows, some interest in movements that are not in the right as well, and certainly overseas they do. Sorry, moving on quickly. Just to give a sample of the partisanism, the partisan sentiment. This is that character Deb Lavoie again, and I'll just play this for you.
My scope is it overlaps somewhat with COVID, but definitely goes beyond it. I am very much focused on the election, the U.S. election in November, because I think it's a very end of the world type of moment.
The virus is just an actor in the broader story.
Exactly.
An end of the world type of moment, and this is so consistent, and this is a much bigger topic. There's no way to get to this just in a live stream, but this explains a lot about the tenor of the news landscape dating back to 2015, 2016. And I noticed this sort of cluelessly back then. I was like, wow, there's been this weird like tonal shift in the job, even when I was back at Rolling Stone. Suddenly there's this panic element in reporting. There's always been if it bleeds, it leads. That's always been part of the news landscape. You think about the Don Henley, singing about how people love it when you lose. Yeah, that's always been true. We've always loved in the news tragedy, death, misery, despair, images of chaos that people are, they rubberneck it. It sells, right? But there's an added element that went beyond that, beginning in like 2016, 2015 or so. And you can see it in basically every news story that comes out. It's always the worst thing ever. It's not just a bad thing happens. Everything is Hitler. Everything is concentration camps. Everything is the worst disaster. It's the apocalypse. It's the end of the world. And it's very useful to have the population geeked up into this mindset and constantly moving from panic to panic, because they become very malleable, very, very impressionable when you get them in that state. But it's also a wonderful way to justify the use or the deployment of certain kinds of information operations. When people are terrified, when they're in a state of believing that, the next moment, the next thing they read might be the last thing before, we enter the Eighth Reich or whatever it is, you can convince them to sign up for just about any kind of program. And, that intense fear, which they've kept up primarily through a couple of big crises. You start with Russiagate, then there's the pandemic, then there's J6, then there was the war in Ukraine. Now, more recently, it's what's going on in Gaza. You keep people in that state, and suddenly it's like what Dostoevsky wrote: everything is permitted. And it's not just something they cynically introduce. You can see that a lot of the people in this world actually think that way, and I think that's important to understand. Anyway, this story, you know, much as was the case when we first started looking at the Twitter files, you know, the only thing you can do at the very beginning of looking at a big lump of documents is to grab hold of a couple of themes here and there, put out some of the more explosive stuff. I think it's important to do that in this news landscape. I think it's necessary because there are so many efforts to manipulate information to put things out as quickly as possible before they have the ability to do what they call left to boom interventions and this kind of stuff. But there are lots and lots of angles to this thing. This thing goes in a lot of different directions. We haven't even gotten through reading even a fraction of all this stuff. So it's going to be a while before you know, Schellenberger, people like Schellenberger, myself, and some others are able to fully report out what's in these documents, and you know, talk about where it's leading. But there's going to be much more coming out, more threads. You know, for those of you who don't know, I'm testifying in Washington again this week, this Thursday. So I'm going to, Michael and I are both going to try to keep putting stuff out this week, and try to keep applying pressure to these folks. And as we learn things, we're going to convey them to you as quickly as possible. But in the meantime, please keep tuning in. Please go to Racket. You may notice that in an effort to try to make sure that people actually saw the story, I didn't put any links to any Racket material. So I'm compelled to actually ask people to go and check out the site. And if you can find it in your heart to subscribe, that would be important to me, because for a variety of reasons, it's been more difficult to get the same kind of distribution that Racket was getting last year. It's being suppressed on basically every platform now. I'm not in begging mode yet, but I will politely ask if you enjoy the material, please subscribe. But that's not what this is all about. This is a big story. We're gonna make as much of it free as we can. That's why I put out these threads, and we hope that it will bring some people out of the woodwork and lead to some more sources, and you know, hopefully we'll learn a little bit more. I mean, the thing that was missing from the Twitter file story, and this is the last thing I'll say, there was kind of a blank spot about between 2016 and 20. Not fully blank. We had details here and there, but between the conception, between the idea the government needed to be more involved in content moderation, and the kind of formal partnerships that we definitely saw emerge in 2020 in the Twitter files, there are some unknowns about what was going on, who was competing for what, which agencies were competing for primacy, what were some of the pilot projects that were out there, what were some of the public-private efforts, what were they thinking. These documents offer a big piece that we were missing to a lot of those questions, and we'll put as much of it as we can out as soon as we can. In any case, thanks so much everybody for tuning in. I'll look quickly to see if there are any questions out there, and doesn't look like it, but if anybody has any, you know, please feel free to to tweet to me or to write into taibbi@substack.com. And next time we do one of these, which will probably be pretty soon, frankly, I'll be happy to talk about all those. In any case, good to see you all again after the holidays, and hopefully we'll have more to talk about soon. All right, take care, everybody. Thanks for tuning in.